Hello. Hi, Hugo. Hugo. I'm just writing the title here and waiting for him. All right, he's online. Let me ask him. Hi. Hello.
Hello there. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine. I'm in beautiful Olinda. Having
Yeah.
time.
Great. Before anything else, before we start, I want to know how was your first Brazilian carnival experience?
That was quite an experience. I went to a big party called, oh my word, I forgot what it's called. Um, anyway, it's one of the biggest. What was the name of the big concert party we went to? Cavalera Navadeira. So it's a really big party, and they had a whole lot of bands, including Latino. There was a DJ from Holland called Martin Garrix, who's kind of super number one in the world kind of character. It was absolutely massive.
Yes, that must have been great.
It was amazing. And it's still kind of going on because even last night here in Olinda, we were in a restaurant and they had all these bloggers walking down the street all in their costumes and stuff like that. So I guess it just goes on forever in Olinda. I don't know.
I guess everywhere around Brazil, carnival has no ending.
It's wonderful. It's a completely unique experience. I loved it.
Yes, I figure. So, for the ones who don't know you yet, who haven't been living in this planet, can you please introduce yourself? Tell us how you got into teaching, what's your story with the LP?
Sure. Uh, um, I I finished university way back. Uh, I didn't do terribly well at university, but I had a really good time, sort of acting and playing music and stuff like that. And I sort of got a degree, but it wasn't great. Uh, and then to try and please my father, because we always do, I went to London and started studying law. Uh,
Law.
the law. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to be a barrister.
All right.
Because in Britain you separate uh, lawyers are separated into solicitors and barristers are the kind of attorneys who appear in court. You know, like anyway. But it didn't really work, and I got more interested in playing the guitar and things like that, and so I abandoned my studies and spent all my time playing the guitar and playing in clubs and writing songs. And I was going to be the next big thing, you know. The only
Musician.
superstar, obviously. The only problem is nobody else thought I was going to be the next big thing, and so it didn't really work. And then it's weird how life works. And then I was talking to another guitarist, and all I can remember about him was the kind of guitar he had. It was a Gibson, and his name was Alan, but I can't remember anything else about him. But we were talking, and he said, "Oh, there's this place you can go to, and if you go there, you can do a 4-week teacher training course.
Mhm.
Then you can get a job, you know, anywhere in the world." And that sounded okay to me.
Yeah. With the salsa or anything similar to that?
It was what became the Celta, but as you can see from looking at me, I'm so incredibly old that this was before the Celta existed. But it was essentially what became the Celta, the course. And so I did this 4-week course, and I, about halfway through, I found that I absolutely loved it. This was, I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. I was 23, sort of, I don't know, 22 or whatever it was, and this thing really suited me. I just sort of thought, this is perfect. This is just, and so I started doing it. I got a job at International House in London, which is where the course was. I met this beautiful girl as well, and we got on very well, and then we more than got on really well, and it turned out that she had been born and she'd grown up in Mexico, so I fell in love with her, and then I fell in love with the idea of Mexico. And so I said, please, can we go to Mexico? Can we go to Mexico? And in the end, she agreed. And off we went. And I spent 2.5 years teaching English in Mexico there, which is where I learned almost everything. Then came back to England, taught in the UK, did a master's in applied linguistics, then went back to Mexico for another few years, and I was director of a large Cultura Institute in Mexico, and then while I was working in Mexico, in Guadalajara, it wasn't originally Guadalajara. Anyway, while I was working in Mexico, I was a teacher trainer. I started teacher training, and I couldn't. I wasn't getting it quite right in the input sessions, and my students were a little bit, I guess, confused, or it just wasn't working. And so I decided to write up notes of what I'd been presenting in the input sessions to give to the trainees, so that if they weren't happy with the input sessions, at least they could read this stuff, and it would be a useful thing for them. And extraordinarily, it turned out that on paper, when I was writing away, it came out better almost than it did when I was talking.
Interesting.
I found it really easy to write about what I wanted to say.
Okay.
Maybe almost easier than speaking what I wanted to say. So I wrote these. This was in the days when you had these machines, Gestetner machines, and stems and things, and I remember that we had different coloured papers. So what was it? Green was sort of methodology, and pink was grammar, and blue was pronunciation. And I wrote all these kind of notes to back up what I'd been saying.
Okay.
But it turns out they really worked, and I had some kind of a voice which my trainees found really useful.
Is that how you became an author?
And that's how I became a writer, because I started writing methodology. So yeah, so that's basically the story, and then went back to the UK after a few years, and I've been living there ever since, and combining writing, training, teaching, and music, because that's still a massive part of my life.
That's great, fantastic. Just before we go any further, people said my mic might be too loud. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you fine.
Yeah. If there is any problem, let me know.
Sure.
So as for the topic you have chosen, I wrote it here because it's long. Why communicative aren't always effective? Can you tell us why you talk about it?
absolutely sure, Joe. By the way, I haven't said what a pleasure it is to see you again. We
Oh,
had the great, well, I had the great pleasure of working with you for about 5 days in Sao Paulo. That was an amazing course we did, I think.
it was.
I really enjoyed it. The group that you were part of was very special.
It was. I am extremely happy to have this chance of talking to you and sharing this with everybody else.
Uh, I think what I want to say, and I will answer your communicative question in
Yeah.
a few sentences, but what I wanted to say was that all the training and development sessions we do in our lives, you're very lucky when you find that you've got a group that just kind of works as a group. And I found that session we did in Sao Paulo in January. Was it in January?
Yes, in the beginning of it.
Wow, time goes so quickly.
Yeah.
I found it was really quite exceptional. The group was terrific,
It was.
and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Right, you asked me about why I think communicative activities sometimes fail, why they don't work so well, and my answer goes something like this. And funnily enough, in my mind, I've got a little video I know of a teacher from Rio de Janeiro telling me about a fabulous activity where her students, I can't quite remember how it works, but they're stranded on a desert island. They've only got one small boat, and they have to decide who can go on the boat, and they have to argue about it. It's a classic communicative activity in the sense that you talk, people vote, you decide, and I can't remember exactly the parameters, how it works, but it's just a great activity, you know. And I think, oh, what fun! And it's or for example, an activity where you divide a class into groups, and each group gets to see a picture. And then you take the pictures away, and then you get a student from each of the original groups, put them together, and they have to describe their pictures and work out what story they're told. Classic communicative activities. They provoke a lot of conversation, a lot of talking.
Mm-hmm.
And we believe, I guess we believe, that by doing that, students will become more fluent, they'll become more used to speaking. Their speaking will become better, and their English will become better. Yes, okay. I understand the benefits of those activities and why they're attractive. Heavens, I've used quite enough of them in my time with my students to know what fun they are. But here's a thought. It's true that if we give students a chance to speak fairly freely and spontaneously in class, they will become more confident speakers.
Probably.
Also, yes, probably, I think, yeah. It's also true that the process of trying to find language to express what you want to say, we know to be beneficial. That's part of the whole language processing sort of brain activity that we it's possible, in the words of Rod Ellis, that communicative activities act as a kind of a switch which takes learnt language and sort of projects it into sort of long-term memory. All of those things are possible. But my concern and interest is, yes, but what do you learn as a result of doing these activities? What language do students learn? Do they actually
Yes.
learn language? Does anything actually happen as a result of these activities in terms of your learning of the
Yeah,
language?
that's exactly what Bruno commented. I don't know if you can read the comment, but he made a question like, maybe it's just a skill using task and not a skill getting task. Students might only be using for, I'm sorry, students might be using the language they already have. Where is the development? That's what you mean?
Something like that. I think uh, I'll see if I can say this again and get this right. I have no problem with the idea that because my students are trying to express themselves in English, they are activating the language that's bubbling around in their head. I understand entirely why the process of doing that is good for you as a language learner. But I want these activities to be more than that. I want them not just to have a kind of language using uh, um, kind of excitement, but I want them to have a kind of language learning
All right.
function as well. I, I want them to have a genuine kind of, I want students to be genuinely cognitively and emotionally engaged in what's going on, so that what is happening, and maybe processing is what's happening, but that it really bites, that it really that it actually has some. This is a technical term, you know.
I'll write it down
It things like,
and quote you.
I'm not quite sure how you spell it, but I'm sure you'll find a way. So that's sort of what we're talking about. How to say that a communicative activity is not just about, but something else is happening, something really important is happening, so that students actually emerge from one of these activities having learned something.
Yes.
Um, and
They learn something new. Have they developed any new language?
yes, that whatever the processing they're going through is, it's had a real impact. It's had an impact that is almost measurable. So let's backtrack a bit. My students have done this wonderful chat, excitement, lots of fun, lots of laughter, maybe, if I'm lucky, if the class is going well. But where's the grit? Where's the beef? Where's the all these cliches? Where's the thing? Whereas what I want them to do is to come out from one of these activities, or rather, what I want is to watch my students coming out of one of these activities and sort of know, because you can see it in front of your face, that something really tough has happened, something really strong, measurable, and lasting has happened.
All right. And in one of our conversations, you mentioned an article that you published in 1982, right? That you had some beliefs about communication and communicative activities back then, and then these concepts have changed over time. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, of course I can. I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I had an article published in ELT Journal, the the British journal, which is so I was so excited to get an article published in this journal, because it's very prestigious. In do I have to say this? In 1982, and it was called "What is Communicative?" And in it, I argued that when we talk about the communicative approach, we shouldn't. Thank you very much. Sorry, someone's just given me some more.
Important, especially after Carnival.
My argument was we shouldn't just talk about the communicative approach. Why? I don't want to get too complicated, but because the problem with the communicative approach was it was a kind of rag bag of when it emerged, when it arrived, when people first started shouting about it and saying, yeah, look, we're going to change the world, which is how it felt at the time. Tremendous excitement. And my argument was, look, it's a mess. It wasn't my argument, it was the argument about it. It's a mess. The communicative approach seems to be something about what we do in the classroom. People talk about activities and getting students to activate their language and lots of speaking, especially speaking, on the one hand. But on the other hand, the communicative approach at the time was all about what we teach. So people started saying we don't just teach grammar and vocabulary, we teach how language is used. And so that influenced syllabuses at the time. So we didn't just, the idea was you wouldn't just have lists of grammar, you'd have also lists of language functions and you talk about how language is used and the rules of use. Everyone quoted back then a very famous article by a man called Del Hines. And the sort of standout quote from that is that there are rules of use without which the rules of grammar are meaningless. So the whole area of sociolinguistics sort of came into the issue of language learning. So you have this really weird situation in which people say, I teach the communicative approach, but what you didn't know, and to this day what you don't know really, is whether they're talking about an approach to the language syllabus or a description of the pedagogy they use or the classroom activities that are involved and so on and so forth. It's all a bit of a mess.
So it starts with the question, I'm sorry, starts with the question, what does communication mean?
Well,
What does communicative mean to the teacher and to the methodology and to the book and to the students?
I agree with that. It's a big question. What does it mean? And further, I mean, a much more profound question is, I'm a communicative teacher. I'm a communicative teacher. Why? Because I want my students to be able to communicate, because that's what language is all about. Yes, but what does that mean? Because you could probably argue that, 1,500 years ago, a teacher who taught grammar, translation, and got students writing on little slates wanted students to be able to communicate. But well, that's arguable. But yes, that they wanted students to communicate. But the only thing is they used sort of grammar, translation, and to get to that end. So
okay,
that wasn't. I think what I'm trying to say is that the whole communicative revolution wasn't terribly focused, because it had these two strands sort of coming in from two different angles. One was here comes the one about the kind of language you want to teach, not just grammar and vocab, but rules of use and things like that. And here comes the one which says we've got to change what we get students to actually do in the classroom. Not just the teacher explaining the grammar and maybe translating, or not just repeating sentences, but let's get students using the language. So in this article I wrote hundreds of years ago now, in 1982, I said, Let's forget all that and just concentrate on the activities themselves.
Okay.
What does a genuine communicative activity look like compared to a non-communicative activity? Like, so for example, a drill, she gets up at 6 o'clock, she has breakfast, she drives to work, she works in a hospital, she has lunch at 1 o'clock, she gets home at 6 o'clock, she watches television, she goes to bed, repeat, repeat, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. That's not a communicative activity.
No.
But a communicative activity, excuse me just saying, I'll see you later, okay? A communicative activity, on the contrary, has the following characteristics. I argued. Number one, the emphasis is on communication. The students have a desire to communicate. They want to communicate. They have a purpose. You use language for a purpose, not just to repeat grammar, but you need to achieve something. There is no materials control. In other words, the materials don't tell you exactly what to say. There's no teacher intervention. And crucially, I said at the time, there's no special language focus. In other words, it doesn't just focus on one item of language.
Okay,
So,
that was in your article, right?
That's the original article. So, okay, here you are, people. Here is my definition of a communicative activity, 6 characteristics. And if you reverse the characteristics, so materials control, teacher intervention, one specific item of language at a time, no communicative purpose, no communicative desire, you end up with the drill or something. So I said, here you are, this is one end of this, one end is a communicative activity, the other end is a non-communicative activity. And you could plot any kind of activity between the two. And that's fine, but what's happened to me recently is that I've started thinking about that again and thinking, is that actually useful, and do you learn anything from describing activities in that way? And I return to my basic point, which is, here's a communicative activity. Get into groups, my dear students, and do this. I want you to want to communicate. I want you to use all and any of the language that you have. Don't focus just on one piece of language. I'm not going to intervene. The materials aren't going to intervene. You've got a purpose. Off you go. But at the end of it, what have you got? You might have fun. That's great. Fun is good. You might have ended up feeling a little bit positive about what you're doing and your language and stuff like that. That's great. But did you learn anything? Did you get any language? Was there any specific language payoff? Because, and then it occurred to me, I'm not sure whether I'm making myself clear. It occurred to me that wouldn't it be better if, instead of talking about communicative activities, we talked about communicative learning activities. Communicative learning activities. Okay. So that the activity was not just a communicative activity, but it actually involved you in learning as well.
Learning, yes.
And that's what I've been working on, and trying to work out if I was going to come up with a definition of communicative learning activities, how would those characteristics be different? What characteristics would I need to use to describe a communicative learning activity? So that's what's been.
Tell us.
I'm nervous about. I'm doing all the talking, but okay. Number one. Number one, a communicative activity needs to involve deep processing. And
what do you mean by processing?
well, I can't remember how I came across this, but I was involved in some discussion online somewhere, and someone said, have you watched the videos by this guy in Stanford University in the States, whose name has suddenly escaped me, and hopefully it'll come back to me in a minute.
Okay.
And he's a professor of psychology at Stanford University. And a few years ago, he does a whole lot of little lectures for his freshman undergraduate students. And remember, he's a psychology professor, and he's trying to explain to them in these little lectures the psychology of learning. There's one of these in which he describes an experiment by Hopkins and Johnson from 1969. So it's very, very, very. And in a minute, I'm going to search for the reference and give you the proper reference so you can follow it up. I'm terribly sorry.
I will share the references with everybody. Whatever you tell me to read, I'll tell them to read as well.
Okay.
So tell me about the video later.
He reported on this experiment, which was done in 1969, for heaven's sake. But and in it, the subjects of this experiment were shown some words. And after they'd seen these words, some time afterwards, the experiment runners, the experimenters, went back to the people and found out how many of these words they could remember. And the subjects were treated in 4 separate ways. Some of them were just given the words, that was it. And then after a time, they went and said, can you remember the words I gave you? Another group of people were given words and told that after a certain period of time, they would be tested to see how many words they could remember.
Mm-hmm.
Another group were given this list of words and told to find the words which had the letter I in them. And the 4th group were given the list of words and told to just look at them and decide which words they liked.
Okay.
And of these people, one group performed significantly better than all of the other groups in their memory of the words. And as I'm sure you will have guessed, and anyone watching this will have guessed, of course, it was the 4th group. That was the group which were told, here are some words, decide which ones you like. And so what this guy says is, he says, that question provokes deep processing. Whereas the group that were told, have a look at these words and find the words with the letter I in them, that's not deep, that's shallow. It's superficial. But the group that were asked, which words do you like? That's profound, that's deep processing.
Okay.
And you learn when you are processing deeply. He goes further in this. This is a 5-minute video, by the way. He goes further than this. He says, the intention to learn by itself is not enough. Because according to this experiment, the students who were told, we're going to test you, showed no difference from all the other ones, not the students, the subjects. In other words, so I'm going to test you so you really try and learn. But that didn't seem to have much of an effect.
Of course not.
But being asked whether you like the words did have an effect. Now, I'm not trying to change the world on the basis of one experiment done 30, 50 years ago. Yeah, 50 years ago.
Yes.
That would be ridiculous. But it sets off in me a significant thought that we learn best when we are involved in some kind of deep processing, some kind of really emotionally engaged. Yeah, totally. So that would be the first thing. I want an activity that my students are involved in to involve them deeply, head and heart, emotional and cognitive engagement. That seems to really matter to me. Deep processing. And some of the communicative activities.
Number one for your list, right? About communicative learning activities.
Yeah.
This was the question someone asked here.
For a communicative learning activity, one of the characteristics has to be deep processing like that. Sorry, I know what I'm rushing to, not rushing. I'm going to get this guy. So his name is Stephen Chu, by the way. So Stephen with a PH, and his surname is CHEW.
Okay.
And I was wrong about the names. The article he quotes is by Hyde, that's with a Y, and Jenkins, and you don't have to write all this down, but it's the differential effects of incidental tasks on the organization of recall of a list of highly associated words, Journal of Experimental Psychology, 1969.
All right. I'm not taking notes anymore.
Okay, so that's the first thing that I think a proper communicative activity needs to have. I'll rephrase, a communicative learning activity.
Learning activity.
But that's not enough. One of the things that really really helps language learning is repetition.
Okay.
If you continually meet a piece of language and understand it, if you continually try and use the same piece of language and have some success in doing it, and you repeat it, then that's really good for you. Repetition works.
It does.
I don't think there's any doubt about that in the literature, in our experience. Repetition works. The problem about some repetition is it's kind of fairly pointless and meaningless. But if you can get students to repeat in a way that is meaningful and has this element of deep processing and has a purpose to it, then that's really something. Because a communicative activity doesn't necessarily demand any language repetition at all. You just
yeah, no language focus at all, right? Whatever emerges and
it just emerges. We could have a discussion about that, by the way. That's a whole other issue. But my communicative learning activities, I want them to have repetition built in. So a classic example would be the students hear a story, get involved in a story, and then they have to tell the story. They have to they have to retell the story,
Okay.
but from a different point of view. We may have done something like this in our group in January, where you have where students hear a story. So that here's a quick story for you. It's a true story. It's about a woman called Catherine Boss, age 35, in Germany. Did you hear this? Did I tell you the story before? I don't know.
I don't think so.
She one day she got on a bike. She rode to the train station. She put her bike on the train in Germany, and she got to the station she wanted to go to. She was actually studying translation, so she was going to a class. She was wearing sort of training pants, a t-shirt. She had a backpack and her dark glasses on her head like that.
All right.
And as she was getting off the train, she got off the train, and another woman was trying to get off the train, but the doors started to close. So Catherine put her hand, she's still sitting on a bike, she put her hand between the doors to try and keep it open. And somehow or other, the woman did manage to get off the train, and then the doors closed on Catherine's hand. And she couldn't get her hand out, and the train started to move. And she found that she was dragged along the platform.
Oh my God.
And it was getting faster. So she sort of kicked the bike out from under her. And now suddenly the train was picking up speed, and she was being dragged along by this train. And it's a long story. It's not a long story. Anyway, the story basically this is a true story, by the way. And she managed to somehow get her foot between the carriages to balance herself and blah, 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 blah. But the train was now traveling at 75 miles an hour, and it had curves, and she was terrified she was going to get smashed by a pylon on the edge of the track, you know, in which case she'd have died instantly, and so on and so on. And the woman on the platform who she'd helped had seen what had happened, was absolutely desperate, and was running up and down the platform until she found a railway employee. And this guy finally managed to phone somebody who phoned somebody, and they managed to phone the driver who stopped the train so that Catherine could reach up and press the button to open the doors, and she fell down onto the track. And the driver came running back down the train to see what all the fuss was about, and he nearly fainted because he thought it was someone who had their hand trapped, who was inside the train, not outside the train. And she survived. She was in hospital for a couple of days, but she wasn't badly hurt. But she was psychologically really in a mess, and she's spent a lot of time and a lot of money getting treatment for this trauma, and then she sued the German rail company for the money she'd had to spend on her treatment, and she won. And the result of her winning was that they changed the laws about trains and so on. And it turns out that now in Germany, train drivers are obliged by law to check back down the train to make sure, and they changed the design of doors because they shouldn't have been able to do that, etc. Anyway, there you are. So here's a story, and actually we might stick with that story. How do I turn that into a communicative activity? Well, the act of listening to the story, if I tell it really well, is communicative in itself. But if I get you to tell the story back to me,
okay,
maybe as Catherine, maybe you're the driver of the train. What happened? Maybe you're the woman on the platform. what happened? Tell me what happened. Maybe you're someone inside the train who saw this happen, but you couldn't do anything about it.
Just saw the hand.
Maybe they didn't have a handle. I don't know. But by retelling the story, by retelling the story from a different point of view, or even just retelling the story, I've got repetition. But if you add in an element which says, I want you to retell the story, don't tell us who you are, and we'll work out who you are, then we've got our purpose, we've got everything, and we've got repetition. We've got good repetition. Because
Meaningful repetition, not just the old drill.
I think it's purposeful, meaningful, and has some point to it. So that would be my that's a sort of explanation of what I mean by that characteristic. And then the third one is that I want you to process language in this activity for meaning, not just for the form of it. So that's rather similar to what we talked about before. There's a what's the game? What's the game? Let me see if I can find. Oh, yeah, here we are. No, that's not the one. Oh, well, this works for me as a concept. There's an activity, very straightforward activity called Everybody Up, which a colleague of mine talks about, and her argument is there should be times during a class when you make all the students stand up, go into the middle of the class and talk to each other in groups, not in pairs, in groups.
Okay.
And you give them a specific task. You ask them, for example, if anyone plays a musical instrument, and if they do, everyone in the group has to find out what instrument they play, where they learnt it, how they learnt it, why did they learn it, how often they practice, where they play, or if no one in the group plays a musical instrument, you have to find out from the group what musical instrument people would like to play and get them to explain why. And that, in an activity like that, you're processing meaning, not just form. There's a task, there's a purpose, and you're focusing on the meaning, finding something out, not just the form. How am I getting on? Am I being? Is what I'm saying making any sense so far?
It does, completely. I'm even thinking about the example you gave before about drills. She cooks, she dances, she plays the guitar, and I was trying to imagine a communicative learning activity for that purpose of teaching and practicing the simple present, for example.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe making an appointment as a group, trying to organize someone else's routine, schedule. Does it make sense according to what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the point is I'm trying to get you, my dear student, to use language in this free way, in this way which is not confined to just one language item, which is a variety of language, which is all this stuff. I want you to have a communicative purpose. I want deep processing. I want your heart to be involved as well as your head. But what's happening with the language? And the language, I want you to be processing the language for meaning, not just for form. And added to that, and this is something you will recognize, because it's something we did when we met in January. Because my fourth characteristic is I want you, while you're doing my communicative activity, to give attention to and make connections between items of language and how they interact with the discourse, with the context they occur in, and so on and so forth. I want you to give attention to the language at the same time as you're communicating, please. And although this doesn't quite work. But when we were together, we heard a story, and then we got sentences from the story and split them up into 3 pieces and mixed them all up. And you had to unscramble them and reconstitute them into the original sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, you have to pay attention to the language. You have to give attention to it, but also how it connects with itself and how it sort of works in the context in which it appears. Now, I'm not saying you do that for every communicative activity, but what happened when I asked you to do that back in January was that you were giving attention to the language. You were making connections between the items of language that were there and working out how they fitted within the context. Now,
Okay.
if we could somehow replicate that in a communicative learning activity, wow.
That's great.
Nearly finished.
We have some questions here.
Yes.
Someone asked about
Really read them. Okay.
private classes and about error correction in communicative learning activities.
I'll come to that absolutely in a minute. I'll rush through the last 2 characteristics, and then I'll stop talking, and then we can have the questions. But error correction is really important. Then 2 other things. I would like my communicative learning activity to provoke interaction between the students' language processing and the text they're involved with, which might be me listening to you, and the other people in the room, but it might also be me listening to a story. It might be even me reading something, because communication we always think of as between you and me, or between us, groups of people, and we generally think of it as spoken, but I'm also interested in what's going on in your head when you're interacting with language. And an activity, again, you'll remember, was one where we looked at a piece of text, and I said to you, find 2 or 3 words or phrases from this text that you would like, you personally would like, to put in your suitcase and take away with you. And so I was encouraging you, supostamente, I don't know how you say that in Portuguese. Supposedly, I was encouraging you to engage emotionally yourself, personally, with a piece of language. And finally, a good communicative activity, which is a bit contradictory, asks you and me to engage with each other and interact with each other. And if there's more people in our little group, a good communicative activity helps us to kind of cohere, to get all huggy and pally with each other. I don't mean that literally, but So there we are. Those are my communicative learning activities, and I've been going on a long time, and I'm sorry, but I'm trying to come up with a different kind of activity that has the benefits of all those fun things, but has a real learning kick as well. Full stop.
Full stop. Okay, so let's go to the question. I also have one question, because the title of this live session was why communicative activities aren't always effective, right? But we have gained something from the communicative approach, and I guess we have lost something as well. What have we lost?
If you talk, my experience traveling around the place, the world, before coronavirus, is that teachers, if you say, almost every teacher in the world will say, yes, I'm a communicative teacher. But if you then ask them what that means, sometimes it means very little. Sometimes it means, well, the teacher teaches like they always taught, like they always taught, but they chuck in a little game at the end of the lesson or a little activity.
It's just fun. It's not communication.
It's just, and the whole of their teaching is not very communicative. At the beginning of the communicative approach, there's a quote that I always use. There's a man called Dick Allwright teaching at the University of Essex, and they were teaching these pre-sessional courses where students would come to Britain, and they were about to do a master's course in Britain in English, and so they would give them X weeks language preparation to get their English up to the level where they could do these courses. And Dick Allwright and his friends got obsessed with the fact that can you do that again, please? Really?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Gosh, I've been talking far too long. I'm going crazy. I didn't know it was that long, Joy. Oh my word. And anyway,
Fine. It's been great. Go ahead.
And they said their idea was, they thought, well, maybe if the language teachers' management activities are devoted exclusively to getting students to solve problems in the target language, then language learning will take care of itself. Well, it doesn't take care of itself. We know that.
Yeah.
So you chuck in some communicative activities, but there's not enough time for them to do anything unless you give them this extra bite by making them learning activities. You had a question about correction or something.
Yes, someone. I think Alini had a question about error correction.
What was the question? Can you remember? Or has it gone?
Oh, it was something like, how do we go about error correction in communicative learning activities?
It's a really difficult one. This look, the received truth is that when students are involved in a communicative activity, you don't interrupt, right? That's what we say. And what you do is you go around, you take your notes, and then when the activity is over, you say, that was wonderful, you're all fantastic. Here are some things I heard, we could correct them, you know? But it turns out that if you ask students when they want to be corrected, they don't want that. They'd much prefer to be corrected at the moment they make the mistake. Universally, if you were to ask students a preference, that's what they'd say. Of course, if you do interrupt them all the time, then they get terribly upset because then they can't communicate. So it's a bit different. But the problem about correcting students when after an activity is they're not terribly interested anymore. Because if the activity was interesting, it's doing the activity that mattered. Not, now let's talk about the mistakes I heard. Boring.
Okay.
But nevertheless, I sort of stick with the idea that if you interrupt students while they're communicating, this may not be tremendously advantageous. But I went to an amazing talk by Rod Ellis. I mentioned the second time I mentioned him, about 3 years ago in Guadalajara in Mexico, and he and I were both at a conference there, and he was arguing passionately that actually the best time to give students feedback and correction and suggestions is when they're really trying to say something.
Okay.
Because then if I offer you correction when you're really trying to say something, you're open and it's going to mean something, which would mean correcting right bang slap in the middle of a communicative activity. Wow.
Okay.
Help. So what do I think now? By the way, I wrote about this way back, saying, look, the idea that you don't correct in a communicative activity is rubbish. But if you do correct, you probably do it very gently. Correction doesn't have to be, you made a mistake, here's the correct answer, say it back to me. That's a classic correction in a drill, right?
Jeremy, I'll have to interrupt you because Instagram is gonna cut us.